Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Rodriguez-Widholm, Executive Director of BAMPFA. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's program, marking the return of Alexander Calder's magnificent 1968 sculpture, The Hawk for Peace, to public view. We are thrilled to have this beautiful, beloved, and ever meaningful work of Calder's back on view and to be among the great cities that are home to one of Calder's magnificent stabiles. As many of you know, this sculpture holds a very special place in the history of our institution, having graced the entry of our original building on Bancroft Way for 47 years. With the move to our new location here in downtown Berkeley, we've had the opportunity to restore and reinstall this work in a new location at the entrance to UC Berkeley, just across the Crescent. I hope you will all take the opportunity to walk over today and view the sculpture on the Crescent Lawn after today's talk. It really looks beautiful beneath the towering redwoods and eucalyptus trees, and by total coincidence, I can see it outside my office window. On behalf of all of us at BAMPFA, I would like to extend a very special welcome to today's guest lecturer, Alex Taylor, who is joining us from the University of Pittsburgh, and also to Megan Calder Hayes, whose grandmother, Margaret Calder Hayes, was Calder's sister and was deeply involved in the founding of our museum. We're so glad to have you here to mark this special occasion. I also want to recognize the generous individuals and agencies that supported the conservation and reinstallation of the Hawk for Peace, including Peter and Beverly Lippman, who are here with us today. Thanks so much to both of you. They were early supporters of this project and cheerleaders all along the way. I also want to thank Frances Hellman and Warren Breslow, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Save America's Treasures program sponsored by the National Park Service and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This monumental undertaking would not have been possible without equally large support, and we're very grateful. I would also like to extend thanks to BAMPFA's Director of Collections and Exhibitions, John Alexander, for his oversight of the lengthy and complex restoration, transportation, and installation process, as well as engagement with numerous stakeholders on and off campus. Finally, I want to thank all of you for being with us here today. I'll now turn the podium over to my colleague, Sherry Goodman, Director of Education, to introduce Alex Taylor. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. I'm happy to introduce Alex Taylor, whose work on late Calder, including his contextualizing of the Hawk for Peace within the larger culture at the time of its making, make him an ideal person to speak on this very special occasion. Alex is an historian of modern American art and visual culture and associate professor in the Department of Art History and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh. As the department's academic curator, he leads collaborations with the local cultural sector with the aim of fostering collection-based research and learning. From 2014 to 2016, Alex was the inaugural Terra Foundation Research Fellow in American Art at Tate, where he led the Refiguring American Art initiative. He's the author most recently of Forms of Persuasion, Art and Corporate Image in the 1960s, published this year by UC Press and available in our bookstore. For today's lecture, he has revisited and revised his prize-winning 2012 essay, Unstable Motives, Propaganda, Politics, and the Late Work of Alexander Calder. We're excited to mark the restoration and reinstallation of the Hawk for Peace with his insights into the multivalent meanings of this iconic and ongoingly relevant work. I know that Alex is planning to mention something about his personal history with and at Berkeley, so I won't do that, but I'll just welcome Alex back to Berkeley.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you to Julie and to Sherry and the whole BAMPFA team for the invitation to speak today. And especially thanks to Lynn Kimura for her research assistance in the museum's files as I prepared this talk. So I'm super delighted to be here to see the Hawk for Peace reinstalled, but I want to briefly and slightly self-indulgently share the more personal reason why this occasion is so special for me. As I will note later in this talk, Alexander Calder spent some time at Berkeley as a young man, and so, as it happens, did I. In fall of 1999, I came to Berkeley for a year as a study abroad student, and in many ways, what I did here that year set the direction for everything I did ever since. I was lucky enough to take art history classes with TJ Clark and Anne Wagner and a bunch of their really brilliant graduate students. And all of those scholars set an example of what it meant to do art history, engage with society and politics in ways that at the time I'm not sure I totally understood, but very much shaped the scholar that I became. It was a special time for me personally and professionally. Like many others, my move to the Bay Area gave me the courage to come out. And I also managed to get my first experience working in an art museum as a volunteer at BAMPFA in the press office. Work that led pretty directly to the decade or so I spent working in the cultural sector in Australia when I returned home. So with that slightly self-indulgent personal disclosure out of the way, that is also to say that the Berkeley stabile was, I think, the first Calder sculpture that I ever saw. I should probably admit that I don't remember it making any particular impression upon me at the time. I also don't remember Calder figuring much in the story of modern art set out by my professors. And for all of his fame and popularity, I fear that the same probably remains true in many classrooms. My talk today is titled Public Objects Revisiting Alexander Calder's The Hawk for Peace. And my nostalgia for this place aside, the revisiting to which my title refers is an essay that I wrote in 2012 titled Unstable Motives, Propaganda, Politics and the Late Work of Alexander Calder. It was my first published essay on Calder, written not long after I finished my first book on Australian art, such that it also marked my first bit of published writing about American art. And the Berkeley stabile makes a brief appearance in this essay, so I wanted to use today as an opportunity to revisit this text, imperfect as it is, and offer some broader thoughts about the politics and the publics of Calder's art, social histories that I regard as inextricable from his achievement as an artist. So to begin properly, let me read how I described my goals for this essay 10 or 12 or so years ago. I wrote, focusing on the output of his later career from the 1950s onward, this article offers new directions for understanding the art of Alexander Calder in relation to the contexts in which it is seen and the uses to which it is put. Calder's popularity in corporate foyers, jet-age airports, and redeveloped urban plazas produced a constellation of meanings that were firmly ideological, but the focus here is limited to the most explicitly politicized contexts of his art. Calder's art, as it was used in the exhibitions of the Cultural Cold War, can be recontextualized by examining the contradictory expressions of political allegiance and dissent that characterized the artist's late career public reputation. What a dreadfully muddy sentence this is 10 years later. Anyway, sorry. The result is a position for Calder's art that is as politically unstable as post-war America itself, vacillating between propaganda and dissent, and demonstrating the potential for abstraction to serve the most apparently opposed political motives. I begin the essay with Calder's earlier Bayonets Menacing a Flower from 1945, the confrontations of its title so directly referencing wartime militarism, to suggest how he was also making art addressed to contemporary events, one among many works that should discourage scholars from regarding Calder's modernism to be unbound from its historical context. I might equally have chosen his contemporary, the General Sherman, weighed down by the ludicrous medals of military glory, or perhaps the proliferating weapons that made the Sherman tank, named after the Civil War hero, such an effective killing machine. I have since learned of other Calder works that engage even more directly with the propagandist visual cultures of World War II and its aftermath. See, for instance, this extraordinary cardboard mobile in which Calder dangles caricatures of Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito from a US dollar, a work that seems to have been made in 1942 for an unrealised project with the graphics division of the Office of War Information, long hidden in the Calder Foundation collection, and one of the more extraordinary works revealed in Jed Pearl's monumental 2-volume Calder biography, completed in 2020. More typically, however, it was abstraction symbolic possibilities that Calder directed towards the war effort, such as this mobile for a Washington, D.C. fundraising exhibition for the organisation France Forever, in which the elements of the tricolour flutter off a yellow cross of Lorraine, the symbol of the French resistance. A less obvious example is Calder's design for a monument to the unknown political prisoner of 1953. 52 or 53, made for a CIA-backed international competition held at the Museum of Modern Art and then at Tate Gallery. A work that I mentioned in my article, but which I have to admit I didn't recognise the specificity of its formal reference until I saw, a few years later, this photograph of Calder posing beside the work, making the V for victory sign such that the sculpture's form is revealed to be doing the same many times over. But alongside Calder's own works in this vein, I describe in my article how the presence of Calder's art in several important touring exhibitions of American art abroad in the 1950s and the installation of more permanent works in sites of national diplomacy saw his sculptures received as visible expressions of American mobility and freedom. As Calder's example helps show, these discourses extended beyond the abstract expressionist painting with which they have been most closely associated. I wanted to nuance this history then by describing the paradox by which the international diplomatic functions of Calder's art coexisted with his work's domestic entanglement in McCarthy-era witch hunts concerning the politics of abstraction, eventually complicated further by the absorption of his modernism into the visual apparatus of the state. Finally, I detailed how these politicised public contexts came into conflict with Calder's own active involvement in anti-war protest activities in the 1960s. On screen, I show you one of his most moving anti-war posters, but I'm also wearing today, it took me a little while to find it, but his anti-war pin for the new mobilisation protest in 15th of November 1969, a design that he designed for that protest and I think also attended. In retrospect, all of this was, I think, kind of way too much to try to cover in a single article, but my goal was pretty broadly to show how Calder's art was kind of buffeted around by the varied political forces that defined the exhibition and circulation of his art at the height of his post-war success. Returning to my essay now, what I realised that I failed to say was that many of these forces were beyond Calder's control, and that none of these often contradictory engagements made Calder exceptional, much less culpable for the imperatives of his patrons or publics. I must admit that I thought that the sheer variety of political forces that I described made this kind of obvious. But now I also understand that for those who imagine great art to necessarily be pure of or immune to such interferences, my narrative somehow seemed faintly accusatory. In retrospect, I did not say clearly enough that the unstable motives of Calder's late career practice are, for me, evidence not of its weakness, but its resonance, the ripples of his work's fundamentally public orientation and interpretive receptivity. This openness was what allowed Calder's art to secure such a formidable place in the visual imagination of post-war America and acquire such rich and plural meanings in the culture at large. Calder's art derives its power, to my mind, from the unpredictable human encounters and interactions it provokes. And this means that I regard the reception and circulation of his works to be essential to their meaning. My perspective here is not just a methodological preference. It's triggered by the very form of his most famous artistic invention, the mobile, whose animation is so often contingent on the motion of the beholder's body and the invisible currents of air by which we are able to alter his sculpture's composition. This is an experience that I am lucky to have relatively frequently beneath his mobile at the Pittsburgh International Airport. On screen, I show you an historical image of the work as it was displayed in the city's old terminal. A perspective on this sculpture that I really like because I think it helps capture how the work's record of the flows of the passing crowd is so appropriate to the terminal experience, and perhaps more generally also to the flux of modernity itself, where the stable coordinates of a compass rose are no match for the disorientation and disjunction of jet travel. Every time I pass beneath it, I find myself in an encounter that feels like an event. My carry-on luggage and I in a dance, not just with Calder's object, but indirectly with all of the other passengers too, even those utterly oblivious to the sculpture's presence, but nonetheless all shaping the work's form above in ways unlikely to ever be repeated. My sense that Calder's works extend beyond the limits of their material form to encompass the human encounters that they invite and incorporate extends to his stabiles too. One way I want to try to capture this is with the drawing on the left, titled known as Family with Sculptures from 1944, in which Calder depicts such a confrontation with sculptural objects he was then working on. He made these works as small plasters, which were later cast in bronze, but they were first imagined as giant concrete monuments towering some 30 or 40 foot tall. This is roughly the scale suggested by the three figures that look up in awe at Calder's sculptural spectacle, as naked as the forms behind them are exposed. When I first saw an image of this drawing leafing through a slim exhibition catalogue for a late 60s exhibition of Calder's bronzes, I was reminded of the work on the left, Henry Moore's roughly contemporary crowd looking at a tied-up object, a drawing Moore first made in 1942 and returned to in other drawings and this print several times in his career. This pairing has been lodged in my brain for years, and so I'm pleased to share it publicly for the first time today, because I think this pairing, and art historians love these kind of comparisons, says a lot about how these two giants of post-war sculpture imagined the encounter between their art and its publics. Where Moore shows his crowd huddling like ancient druids before some mysterious object, obedient to the elemental force emanating from beneath its shroud, Calder's more individualised visitors, not a huddled anonymous mass, but a family of three, seem poised to engage with the object before them. It's only more recently that I began to see other related drawings that corroborate this sense of imminent interaction. In one instance, Calder's spectators abandon the distanced viewing to mount the artworks like rides at an amusement park, registering perhaps the broader terrain of playground sculpture that Isamu Noguchi and other contemporaries were also then exploring. Calder has a central figure whoosh down his sculpture like it's a giant slide. Others take a break from the fun to eat and drink. One sits on the base of a sculpture to watch the commotion above, while another seems to need the paper's edge to hold him up after a bottle of wine. Further drawings of this garden of earthy delights evidence Calder's career-long mockery of modernism's self-importance. On the left, a dog lifts its leg on a sculpture. In another, a nude man pokes his face at an abstracted figure, unable to respond. The latter drawing might depict his sculpture titled A Detached Person, named after the separate elements that make up its form, but the human encounter that Calder imagines seems anything but one of detachment, much less the reverential distance demanded by modern art's more conventionally self-absorbed forms. These drawings were made more than 2 decades before the Berkeley Stabile, but I do think that they capture something about Calder's orientation towards the public that his later works retain. To get us closer to the Berkeley Stabile, I want to play for you on screen some brief film footage of Calder interacting with his sculptures for a newsreel coverage of a 1963 exhibition. Outtakes, I think, in which he is seen ducking beneath the legs of his sculpture and running his hands over its surfaces. In one moment, coming up, which I love, he nestles his body in an alcove formed by the sculpture's elements and moves his ample figure into the classic pose of a calendar pin-up. This is, I think, clear. It's a performance for the camera, for sure, but it also represents a kind of interaction that I think his stabiles invite. There's more of this on YouTube if you would like to keep watching it, but I will move on at this point. Consider, for instance, his Le Guichet, or the ticket window, Calder's stabile for the Lincoln Center, whose title not only turns its abstract aperture into a window through which we might interact with another human, but turns such an encounter into a performance of its own, an experience with art that requires no ticket at all, and in so doing, offers an alternative to the pricey, highbrow culture for which the centre was then so vehemently criticised. To be clear, I am not suggesting that Calder has made a sculpture here that represents a ticket window, but I do want to claim that the work's title captures meaningful aspects of the kind of engagement it was meant to provoke. The significance of Calder's titles is a matter where I find myself somewhat at odds with the party line. A fascinating essay by Calder Foundation President Sandy Roa, who I show on screen in this delightful photograph in which he stands beside his grandfather at the installation of Le Guichet, details several instances where, in his view, the descriptive appellations for Calder's objects have resulted in, quote, overly simplified understandings of his art, and in so doing, quote, minimised his intellectual achievement. According to Roa, the fact that Calder allowed the titles of his works to be, quote, switched or modified indicates his, quote, indifference in expressing something about a work through its title. And yet, even if one accepts that Calder did not intend for his titles to be used as keys for interpretation, their significance in shaping the reception of his works out in the world is, in my view, rather more incontestable. If we go so far as to understand these interactions as part of the work itself, then they become all the more impossible to ignore. Interestingly, the Foundation does not always share the indifference that it is claimed Calder felt towards the choice of his titles. Take this important early work, known for decades as Calderberry Bush, the title in which it was included in multiple Calder retrospectives, and as it is named in the artist's 1967 autobiography. As Roa explains, research has established that the work was first exhibited with a different title, Object with Red Discs, and it is this title that the Foundation has come to prefer and that the Whitney Museum of American Art catalogue now singularly adopts. Another variation is Hello Girls at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the long-standing title for this fountain, recently demoted to a parenthetical edition after a hitherto unpublished title, 3 quintains, newly found on the rear of an undated photograph in the Calder Foundation's files. While I understand that such matters are important facts for cataloguing, I worry that these decisions shrink the interpretive footprint of his works. I would further note the preference here for plainer, more formally oriented titles over more playful, metaphorical ones. And these choices are, I think, part of what I perceive as a broader effort to secure Calder's position in a rarefied modernist canon premised on its seriousness and separation from everyday life, a move that might seek to elevate his status in a certain kind of art history, but that for me ultimately diminishes what I think makes his brand of modernism so distinctive. Now, the relevance of all of this to the Berkeley stabile, as some of you might already know, is that its title has a very interesting history, and one that returns us to the political engagements with which I began. When I was writing about this work for the first time from the distance of Oxford, somehow I got my hands on a copy of this, the slim, pale blue dedication pamphlet published for the sculpture's dedication ceremony in October 1970. As the booklet explains, the sculpture is dedicated to the memory of Kenneth Arand Hayes, the husband of the artist's sister and longtime Berkeley Hills resident Margaret Calder Hayes, who spearheaded the acquisition. The booklet includes some personal details about the family's connections to Berkeley, including a passage concerning the artist's social and political bonds with his brother-in-law that is worth quoting at length. The association of Alexander Calder with the University of California dates back over half a century. In 1913, his father, Alexander Sterling Calder, was appointed sculptor-in-chief of the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Sandy enrolled in Lowell High School in the city, and Peggy entered the University of California in Berkeley. During the next 2 years, Sandy divided his time between observing his father at work on the sculpture for the exposition and joining in his sister's social life on the Berkeley campus. At the time, Sandy met his future brother-in-law, Kenneth Arand Hayes, a debonair sophomore who wedged his scholastic endeavours between campus activities. The two men shared a lively interest in sports in those halcyon days before World War I, the draft, the bomb, or pollution. I love the idea that in the teens there was no pollution. In the years that followed, Sandy and Kenneth continued to enjoy one another. Both men, though widely separated by geography and profession, Hayes was in business, had a common feeling for equality, freedom, and peace. The focus here on shared histories and values is meaningful. Hayes had died in June 1966, and many of those at the dedication of Calder's stabile would have remembered the awful circumstances of his passing. At the age of 71, Hayes collapsed halfway through delivering a speech on campus. Newspaper reports printed his unfinished address, which began with a nostalgic reverie for the Berkeley of his youth before turning to the tumult of the campus in the mid-1960s. Quote, "Research has given the world the atom bomb and segregated the growth hormone. It will take wisdom as well as knowledge to control these discoveries and bend them to the benefit of man instead of to his destruction. It is good that today's young people are more serious, more impatient." At this point in his speech, Hayes reportedly paused and said, "I'm sorry," and then slumped to the ground. 4 years later, at the dedication of the sculpture acquired in his memory, the booklet's reference to Calder and to his shared wish for, quote, equality, freedom, and peace sought, in a way, I think, to complete the speech that he never could. But I also think the political references in the booklet had a more practical purpose, and that was to deal with uncertainties concerning the work's title. A note in the program sought to resolve the issue. It reads, during its construction, Hawke went under the name of Boeing, a nickname given to it by the workers. However, since it was conceived as one of a series and followed Falcon, it is officially called Hawke. End quote. It's impossible to read this note, especially with its careful substitution of the authority of the artist with the logic of the series, as though somehow H for Hawke automatically follows F for Falcon, and the anxious effort to distinguish between the work's nickname and official title, regardless of which came first, without recognising that this note represents just the traces of a more fraught behind-the-scenes discussion. The first title for the work, Boeing, arrived before the work itself, in a letter sent by the artist to his sister. The letter reads, quote, from Calder, "Here are some photos of the Boeing, the name the men have given it, and a good one." The men to whom Calder refers are the steel workers at Beaumont in Tours, the foundry responsible for making many of his monumental works since 1962. Calder's turn of phrase here is kind of cunning, much like his outsourced production methods, techniques that would play such an important example for a younger generation of sculptors also embracing subcontracted sculptural production. He outsources the work's title. Far from indicating his indifference to their choice or falling back on something more purposefully neutral, Calder importantly confirms that he likes the name that they chose, and in so doing delegates this interpretive act to the Calder's first audience, that is, the workers who fabricated it. I suspect that Calder would have also liked the title Boeing for its pun on the word bowing, B-O-W-I-N-G, to describe its curving metal wings, and also perhaps for its proximity to the onomatopoeic word, the sound really, of boing. Feels like that I can do better than that, right? Boing! As though at any moment these wings might spring back into the flat steel plate from which they are bent. I assume it's a typo, but this is in fact the spelling of the title that appears in one Western Union telegram concerning the work's shipping. But I also think that the name of the Seattle-based airplane manufacturer would also have appealed to Calder. He had long been engaged by the imagery of flight and was among the jubilant crowd cheering Charles Lindbergh when he landed in Paris in May 1927, making soon after this wire allegory of the wonders of transatlantic crossing. In the post-war decades, the motif of suspension and motion essential to Caldermobiles saw his works installed in terminals in Chicago, New York, Dallas, and Pittsburgh. He also undertook industry commissions, including an airline ticket office in Beirut, and most famously would design the colourful livery for several Braniff Airlines jets. All of this means that I don't think we should dismiss Boeing as merely a temporary nickname, especially given that the company was then front-page news for their work on a supersonic jet intended to compete with the Concorde project, its elongated form not entirely dissimilar to Calder's long-tailed object. Indeed, Peggy Hayes thought that the work's title merited a sponsorship request to the Boeing Corporation itself. Quote, "Maybe they would help with the expense, what with the free advertising," she wrote to the museum's director, Peter Seltz. Seltz took up the suggestion and contacted a staffer in the Chancellor's office to help solicit funds for the work. Now, the support never eventuated, but the work was also never contingent on the request, and Calder arranged for it to leave Europe from Le Havre in August 1968. It arrived at Pier 80 in San Francisco in September, from where it went into storage. And in the museum's files, there's a fabulous series of contact sheets showing museum staff inspecting the cargo to see the work for the first time, including a couple of frames in which Calder's aluminum marquette is fished out of the giant crate and thrust skyward to the evident delight of those present, taking its title, I think, as an invitation to imagine this object zooming into the air like a toy airplane. In May 1969, as preparations for the installation of the work on campus were finalised, a letter from Seltz to the artist mentions the possibility of a name change with considerable delicacy. Your Boeing is about to be installed. I think the name which was given to the piece expresses its feeling of strength and movement admirably. I believe, however, that your sister Peggy has written to you suggesting a change of name. If you should wish to have such a change of name made, please let me know what other name you might prefer. Let me say again, however, that I am very fond of the present title, but would like to know your preference before we install it. Now, I haven't found the correspondence that directly explains the grounds for the change or confirms Calder's intervention one way or another, and I think some of it probably happened over the telephone. And I would say that I am sure that there are other archives at Berkeley that might contain more clues to this history. But I think it's pretty safe to guess that at the heart of a campus whose student protests had been in part spurred 3 years earlier by the presence of military recruiters on campus, someone recognised that the naming of this giant hunk of black steel after a major military supplier might raise eyebrows, or worse. Seltz seems sceptical, even slightly resistant to the idea of changing the title. But we should note that his letter to the artist is dated just 3 days before the protests that led to the shooting in People's Park, a context in which the installation of this work on campus might well have prompted a more cautious attitude. And yet, the title that would replace it was also destined, perhaps even more so, to preempt questions concerning the work's ideological leanings. Installed on the lawn in front of the Campanile in July '69, but not formally dedicated until the following October, the hawk was adopted as the work's title, the official title, as the dedication booklet puts it. The museum itself opened in November 1970, but the sculpture was not moved there to its entry until mid-72, and it was at this time that the title was further adjusted to its final incarnation, presumably because someone pointed out that the choice of bird might be interpreted to pick sides in the polarised representation of attitudes towards the Vietnam War as either hawks or doves. Even as the work's installation was being planned, several versions of this third title were in circulation. One handwritten memo captures the uncertainty as /the hawk of /for peace, and the label on the rear of a press photograph registers the revisions in a more linear fashion that adds up to the title that finally stuck. This label makes me very sympathetic to the poor press officer who, kept having people knock on their door telling them that it had a new title this month. But even as this final title sought to clarify the politics of Calder's sculpture, it is ironic that it was only at this point that its allegiances would finally be called into question. In the Daily Californian, the work was caught up in broader discussions concerning the museum's opening and the, quote, art elite it was understood to serve. Claiming that the new building looked like a, quote, sealed structure, architectural historian Mark Tribe complained that the placement of Calder's work, quote, further restricts the entrance and makes it more difficult to find. For Tribe, this was also a matter of the proper audience for Calder's sculpture. He wrote, quote, did you ever wonder why the Calder stabile, which by now has been seen by a large number of people as it stood out in front of the Campanile, was moved over to the Arsenal for Art and off campus, he wrote. Tribe's questions hinge on judgments concerning art's rightful public and the attendant politics of public space. Questions prompted not just by Ciampi's brutalist stronghold, I suspect, but also by Calder's own somewhat aggressive form, its hawkish properties forced as they were to declare their anti-war stance, more unambiguously. These kind of disputes were triggered by almost every one of Calder's monumental stabiles in the 1960s and 1970s. The terms of debate were inconsistent and invariably negotiated through the encounter between Calder's imported art and the local contexts within which it intervened. At MIT, for instance, the initial installation of La Grande Voile prompted student picketing, notable enough for Calder to recall their noisy protestations in his autobiography. Quote, "Please take it away," yelled one student over a loudspeaker. "We want our grass back," said another. There has been a tendency to frame such conflicts as battles between enlightened tastemakers and ignorant Philistines. But as much as this polarized framing might seem to take the artist's side, I think it ultimately does a greater injustice by sidestepping the role of Calder's monumental sculptures in the remaking of urban space in the 60s and 70s. This is a topic that I want to tackle in more depth one day, and in more depth than I can today, but I will pick just his most famous monumental stabile by way of example, the iconic La Grande Vitesse, rightly celebrated for its transformative impact on the city of Grand Rapids, and indeed on the history of public art. But it is equally relevant to know that the sculpture arrived in the aftermath of the Grand Rapids riots, triggered in part by housing shortages that had resulted from urban renewal projects that wiped out poor and mainly black neighbourhoods in the downtown core. This was emptied space that Calder's art was brought in to fill. Urban renewal in Grand Rapids also faced fierce opposition among heritage advocates too, conflicts that made national news when a mother of four chained herself to a wrecking ball in a last-ditch effort to save the City Hall clock tower. The tower is visible in photographs of the dedication ceremony of La Grande Vitesse in June 1969, but would be flattened by the end of the year. These kind of encounters are essential to the meanings of Calder's sculptures. Much recent writing about Calder tends to dodge such entanglements in public discourse, favourable or otherwise, emphasising instead his proximity to the canons of high modernism rather than the social spheres into which his art was drawn, a world in which his work's life among family and friends eventually intermingled with broader publics. It is for this reason that I find period newspaper coverage of Calder's art such a rewarding source for understanding these relations. But I would also note the importance of books like these from the 1970s to understand his art's sociability. The intimate intergenerational portrait, Three Alexander Calders, by Margaret Calder Hayes, is worth a shout out in the present context. But no book captures the sheer range of encounters Calder's art proposed better than Jean Lippman's Calder's Universe, published alongside the Whitney Museum's 1977 touring exhibition. Towards the end of his Calder biography, Jed Pearl writes of his worry that Lippman's book, quote, treats the many variegated products of his imagination with too much of a democratic touch, end quote, and in so doing risks the possibility that, quote, readers of the catalogue would lose sight of the towering achievement of Calder's sculpture. Pearl's biography is in itself a towering achievement, and my own copy has quickly become dog-eared as I have pored over its many discoveries. But the idea that it is possible to treat Calder with too much of a democratic touch, or indeed that a democratic touch is incompatible with serious art, is one that I find hard to accept. Calder's plurality and popularity cuts for me right to the core of his achievement, an art that is of, for, and I would say at some level even by the people. The involvement of Calder's art in the politics of public space writ large is, I think, inextricably connected to the ways in which his objects inspire human action at a more personal level through bodily interaction. And so it was a delightful coincidence to come across the painters touching up the base of the sculpture when I first saw the work yesterday. Now, I know we are not meant to ride the hawk for peace in the way that Calder imagined of his sculptures in 1940s drawings, but I think we can all imagine the likelihood that some wayward undergraduate will indeed mount its tail to celebrate graduation or a football victory. In exploring the work again, I discovered something that I had not previously seen. 4 hidden apertures, the largest of which one can easily bend beneath the work and put one's head into. And so, without a conservator in sight, that's exactly what I did yesterday. So that anyone who looked towards the newly installed sculpture at that moment would have seen my legs poking out from its undercarriage, like Barney Rubble preparing for some prehistoric takeoff. I did this alone, but in looking at those other empty shapes from the inside, I realised that the diminishing heights required for others to do the same would be perfect for the family of 3 that Calder had imagined visiting his sculpture decades earlier. Plus, all the way near the ground, their little dog too, ready to interact in its own unconstrained way. Thank you.